Hey everyone, welcome to the webinar. For those of you joining live, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy day. And for those watching the recording, thank you for your interest. This is the Streamlining the Delivery of Unbundled Services with Document Automation webinar. And we will straight into intros. My name is Andreas Becker. I'm the Director of Sales at Lawyaw. I'm an attorney, no longer practicing, but it helps having that background because I talk to attorneys all day. And I was fortunate enough to meet Dave a couple years ago, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Yes, my name is Dave Ahrens. I'm the CEO of Unbundled Attorney. Been in the industry for my entire adult life, working on helping clients obtain affordable legal services through lawyers and helping lawyers build highly profitable practices, providing unbundled services and other affordable options. So looking forward to sharing a little bit more about how technology has helped to streamline the delivery of these services and make them more profitable for lawyers.
Awesome. And, kind of thinking about, why are we even doing this webinar? Why does it make sense? And Dave and I, initially when I thought, we kind of sit at somewhat different ends of the spectrum for attorney services and vendors and their workflows. But increasingly, we've been working together, and there are a couple of reasons for that shift. One of them is there are just changes in the market. There are more attorneys offering unbundled services at the moment. And the other one is just there are changes in technology in terms of more tools to help attorneys offer those services efficiently. Someone just emailed me something. I'm going to turn off my video to give everyone a little bit more real estate, but just some guidance from the Florida Court Committee on Unbundled Services. They're kind of following suit with Arizona and Utah, but comments to their rule: limited representation may be appropriate because client has limited objectives for the representation, or because the client may wish to exclude actions that the client thinks are too costly. I mean, we see a lot of headway moving towards this kind of unbundled services option, really helping consumers, and technology is moving in that way as well. Just a little bit about Lawyaw by the numbers for people who don't know what we are. We are a legal document automation and workflow software. We're 5 years old, founded in 2016. We're working with over 1,200 law firms across 37 states and 5 countries. We're almost at 1.8 million documents. I still got the 1.7 million documents generated through Lawyaw and over 350,000 e-signatures. So we've been around for a little while, and we kind of know the terrain, we know the territory. We're still getting used to different practice areas, but those unbundled services, those are the ones that we really, really specialize in. I'll let Dave speak to Unbundled.
Yeah, so we're Unbundled Attorney. We have a network of 400 plus active unbundled attorneys all across the United States, delivering these services to clients that we deliver to them via our lead generation platform. So we both educate attorneys about how to implement these unbundled services into their practice, and then we also educate the public and let them know that we have attorneys available that can provide them with unbundled services and limited scope representation and affordable full representation and so forth. And we generate those, and then those clients request to be connected to an unbundled attorney in their local region, and we deliver those client leads to the lawyers in their specific practice areas. So these are the practice areas that we serve: family law, which is probably the most conducive for unbundled services. We also generate leads for immigration, bankruptcy, estate planning and probate, and landlord tenant. So if you are practicing any of these areas, we would usually be able to generate leads for you, and then also provide resources to help you with delivering unbundled services as well through our trainings and so forth. Andres, you want to talk about the agenda here?
Yeah, so Dave's going to lead, and he's going to talk about serving the market majority and kind of diving into how the legal market and consumer expectations have changed over the years, and then is going to provide some tips for adopting unbundled services. I'm going to move into a little bit of talking about streamlining service delivery with technology, document automation and action. I'll give a couple of examples of documents that we commonly work with in practice areas. I'm going to do a very brief demonstration. This is not meant to be salesy, but just kind of taking into account everything that we presented, kind of showing you how that might operate. And then Dave's going to take back over, just talking about what does that effectively look like? When you take these tools and put them in place, how can you increase your profitability while keeping your rate the same, which is really the goal of these unbundled services, getting them out to as many consumers as possible. But, thinking of yourself as a business person and treating your practice as a business, regardless of the fact that the main thing is that we want to help people. And then we'll leave a little time for Q&A at the end. If you have any questions along the way, just pop them in the chat. You can do it in the question section, but most people just put it in the chat. And if there's something particularly kind of juicy that we want to stop and address, we absolutely will. But we're leaving time for Q&A at the end, so don't worry. We will get to everyone's questions as they come in. And with that, Dave, I'll let you lead.
Okay, awesome. All right, so Unbundled Services, in addition to the Bar Association's release of all the ethics opinions, providing the support that attorneys need ethically to administer these legal services, are in response to some pretty significant changes in the legal industry and the marketplace. And I'm going to describe some of those changes here just so you guys get a sense for the fact that the delivery of unbundled services has become a lot more of a necessity because of the way the markets have shifted over the past 20 to 30 years, right? So if we look back about a half century here in 1971, about 1% of the filings in family court were by pro se litigants. We fast forward to 2019, and over 70% of the filings in the family courts are by pro se litigants, that's not represented by an attorney. So what that means is, back in 1971, 99% of the people that would go to court in family law would be hiring an attorney to assist them with their case, whereas nowadays that number is less than 30%. Right. So what we have here is basically, 1/3 of the number of clients being represented by an attorney as there were 30, 40, 50 years ago. Right. So you have a big significant shift in the number of people that are now going to court representing themselves. Some of that is financial factors, people's inability to pay, a $5,000 to $10,000 retainer. It also relates to the availability of forms online. And, call it client's assumption that all they have to do is download those forms, file them, and they'll get to go in front of Judge Judy and tell their case, right? So, which obviously isn't the way it works in family court. So, but those availability of forms, people want to try to handle parts of the case on their own because the forms are available, but it's just not that easy, not that simple. And so a lot of people end up making some mistakes. So we have this trend of all these folks that are now filing and representing themselves in the family courts. And then we also at the same time have this trend. So back in 1971, there was 207 million people in the United States. And for those 207 million people, there was 342,000 lawyers, right? So that was one lawyer for every 605 people. Back now in 2019, 329 million people in the United States, 1.340 million lawyers, right? So there's now one lawyer for every 245 people, okay? So we've got 3 times as many lawyers per person as there were 50 years ago, competing for what is now 1/3 the number of clients, right? That are actually going out and hiring lawyers to represent them in family court, right? So it's not exactly a pretty picture, right? It starts to look more like something like this, where you have a huge, crowd of boats all competing for a limited supply of fish, right? So what do you do? When you have this kind of marketplace, this market shifts, well, what we do is you, instead of going after, you can pivot your practice towards the clients that are currently unrepresented by an attorney. So rather than competing with all the other attorneys that are going after those 30% of clients that can pay the $5,000 to $10,000 retainers, there's an abundance of clients that are single parents or working families that can afford $500, $1,000, $1,500, $2,000, $2,500 for a representation, but just can't necessarily pay the huge retainer fees up front. And so they're pivoting their practice and fishing in a completely different pond. This is the pond where there's not a whole lot of fishermen, right, that are approaching their practice as of yet. More recently, there's been a lot more attorneys starting to offer unbundled services, limited scope. We're certainly hearing most attorneys nowadays know what unbundled services are, whereas even 5 years ago, we would talk to attorneys' offices, they wouldn't really even know what the concept is. So it's starting to gain a lot more traction and get to a lot more implementation by firms, but there's still not very much competition. And of course, you've got a sea of fish, 70% of the marketplace to choose from to be able to build your practice with, providing service to them, right? So how do our lawyers do that, right? How do the unbundled attorneys or attorneys that provide unbundled services deliver services to this market majority. And so that's what we're going to talk here. I'm going to give you kind of a snapshot view of how to deliver unbundled services. And then we're going to talk about how the layer of technology has been able to streamline the delivery of those services to make them a lot more efficient and therefore a lot more profitable as well. Okay, so let's talk about unbundled services. There's basically two main ways in which you can provide unbundled services. One is considered, a la carte. It's also known as vertical horizontally, or basically, task by task or discrete task representation. And then you also have pay-as-you-go, or limited assistance representation is also known for, limited scope representation, or horizontal unbundling in terms of a timeline of a case, phase by phase, or what a lot of our attorneys call just pay-as-you-go. Right? So let's talk about a la carte unbundled services. These are some examples of a la carte unbundled services that attorneys provide every day in our network. Writing a letter, making a phone call, giving some advice, and doing some legal research. So that could include coaching a client on how to handle certain aspects of the case themselves. Could give advice and review documents. And then number 4, give legal advice and document preparation. So number 4 is probably by far the most common service option that any of our attorneys offer. And that's where you're, drafting drafting documents for the client, advising them on how to file, sometimes filing it for them. And then the client is then proceeding to represent themselves pro se with the documents that you have prepared for them, right? So drafting all that paperwork for them, giving them advice and some strategy, preparing that written declaration or that affidavit, then the client files and goes represent themselves from there, okay? So then so that's all the a la carte unbundled services, meaning I'm just helping them with one aspect of the case, right? Helping them draft a letter, giving them some coaching, reviewing some documents, advising the client. And you'll notice in every one of these 3 cases here, you've got legal advice, right? And that's really one of the core unbundled services, is advising a client on the rights and options, how to proceed, and so forth. And then you also help them with drafting documents. And then that's it, right? And then the client represents themselves pro se from that point forward with the completed documents and the additional advice that you've provided, okay? And the secondary level is what you call pay-as-you-go unbundled services. This is the limited scope or limited assistance, LAR representation. This means you are drafting documents, giving advice, and also entering a limited court appearance, right? And this is usually where lawyers will go break up the case into one phase at a time and help them with just that next phase. And so they're limiting the scope of their involvement down to drafting documents, advising the client, and then just representing for that next hearing, right? And anytime you're providing unbundled services, you're going to craft what's called a limited scope retainer agreement. This is a document that's signed by you and the client, which just outlines the scope of the services that are going to be delivered under that agreement. So that would be the services that you're going to be providing, as well as the services that you will not be providing, right? And then you use your flat rate or hourly fee for the delivery of those limited scope services, right? So you draft that retainer agreement, and then if you're going to be entering a limited appearance, then you can provide a notice of limited scope representation, notice of limited appearance. Many of the courts across the country now have these documents available to you from a procedural level, where you can just take the forms that are provided by the court, attach that to your petition or your motion, and then that informs the court and notifies them that you're going to be providing limited representation. You're only appearing for that initial hearing. It describes the scope of the representation, and then you're able to then file the notice of withdrawal or limit of or representation, so you don't have the same issue that lawyers would have in the past, where they would go to court, and as soon as they showed up for a hearing, they were basically on the hook to continue representing that client from that point forward, as it is with criminal law or some other practice areas. But nowadays, if you're entering a limited appearance and you provide proper notice, then ethically you're not required to continue to represent that client. And so you can, do a flat rate service for that client, draft the documents, appear for that hearing, and then from that point forward, once that hearing is complete, you can either proceed with providing, creating a new agreement and giving additional representation to that client, or end the relationship at that time without any further commitment. And what we find over the years is that a lot of clients will, once you've hired them for one phase of the case, they will transition and want to hire you for additional services. But at that point, it's up to you as to whether you want to continue representing that client, rather than being in a position right off the start. If you sign full representation, you're kind of in for the whole case, regardless of whether you want to or not. Whereas limited representation gives you the ability to decide if you want to continue to help to assist that client, or just end the relationship after that initial appearance, or for drafting those documents. Okay, so this is an example of the unbundled services. And then when it comes down to providing unbundled services, a lot of our attorneys will deliver them as a flat rate, right? So they'll charge $1,000 or $1,500 to draft paperwork, or $1,500 to draft paperwork and do an appearance. And so when you're offering a flat rate service, it becomes really important how quickly or how efficiently you can get those services out the door. Because if it takes you 5 hours to deliver a $1,500 service, that's $300 an hour. Whereas if it takes you 3 hours, that's $500 an hour, right? That's a lot better. So what we've seen over the recent years, especially with the advent of Lawyaw and legal technology, is this streamlining of the delivery of legal services so that it becomes a lot more efficient and therefore a lot more profitable. And so, Andreas, maybe you can take away with talking a little bit about how document automation has improved these workflows and streamlined this process for attorneys.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. That was really helpful. And Dave and I, like I said, we've been working more closely together. And one thing that I hear kind of, and it's in a good way, but very often people come over from Unbundled and they'll just say, I am buried in leads. I have too much work to do, like in the best way possible. And what's great about Unbundled Services, like Dave said, that is it's kind of more of a blue ocean in terms of there's, and I mean, just from a, what we're trying to do as attorneys, there's, 80% or 90% of people with a legal problem aren't getting representation because they can't afford it. Unbundled Services gives greater access, but it's also a really great way to just kind of run your business, whether you want to only do Unbundled Services or you want it to just be as, this more predictable revenue stream that you have as an aspect of your practice as you, kind of wait for some of those more complex, bigger cases. The beautiful thing is most of that work is very, very easy to automate. And you probably heard, the term workflow thrown around quite a bit lately, kind of liberally, I would say. It's not meant to be intimidating. Regina Edwards, she's one of our users. She's a very well-known family law attorney in Georgia. And I thought she just put it very succinctly at the ABA Tech Show conference earlier this year. She just said, workflows are just documented processes with automation layered on top. And I found this breakdown to be pretty helpful as just a very high-level blueprint for the specific areas of a given practice and kind of those areas that you might want to look to automate. The technologies that Dave is talking about, Lawyaw included, but just legal tech in itself, they're just ways to kind of abstract some of the complexity if you want to get complex in terms of understanding like how clients move through your case life cycle. But what I really stress to people is that they need to just get started in terms of just from an exploratory or experimenting or investigatory standpoint. I think this is important to touch on as attorneys. It's natural for us to overthink things. We're analytical people either by nature or by training. We're very risk averse. That's great for when we're working out for clients. It is a little less helpful when we're kind of evaluating our own practices and the attendant processes. So what I always stress, anyone who's been one of my webinars, it's always, whatever your goals are, making money, scaling the practice, retiring, spending more time with family, being able to work remotely. Think of it in terms of those goals. Think of yourself as a business owner who happens to be an attorney and not the other way around. And speaking to what Dave was talking about, sometimes people feel bad because, we were talking about, well, if you can do that work in 5 hours, you're making $300 an hour. If you can do it in 3 hours, you're making $500 an hour. It's not just your legal expertise. I mean, that's a huge component of it, but it is the time that you put in as a business owner to figure out the processes that work and comply with both, local regulations and laws and what have you, but also for the consumers that you're serving. So, if I do a job in 30 minutes, it's because I spent 10 years learning how to do it in 30 minutes. You owe me for the years, not the minutes, because it takes some time to really refine these things. Again, the nice thing is you can get a really quick lift by just using a couple of specific legal technologies kind of at those different intersections I was talking about along that client life cycle. But in terms of, kind of document automation in general, kind of where we decided to sit, I used to use some softwares or I tried to use them when I was practicing. I think I'm relatively tech fluent, but it was very difficult setting up a template and I was doing. I had no clue how much copying and pasting and find and replace all I was going to be doing as an attorney. And what we try to do is really just kind of lower the barriers to technology adoption for legal professionals by making things easy. You know, we deal with lots of very sophisticated attorneys, but, you know, their job is to be an attorney, and some, you know, are really into the tech scene, some not so much, and we want everyone to be able to benefit. And so, you know, basically what we kind of started with the California court forms, and then added on the federal immigration forms, and easily automate those. But what we've really been concentrating on is our Microsoft Word templating tool, so that anyone can, you know, create a template in our system, organize it as like a template set, kind of figure out what your different workflows are, you know, ease data input, either just, you know, through by yourself, by, you know, one of your assistants, but make it kind of like a very easy workflow for you to follow, or by importing in from another data, a data resource. And then just giving you a very quick view of what that document's going to look like, kind of accelerating the drafting time. And the value, I mean, obviously, like saving time, that's kind of at the top when we're thinking about just raw numbers and going back to that, am I making $300 an hour or $500 an hour? So yeah, obviously we want to make things quicker. And the rule of thumb I've gotten is anytime you do something more than twice, it should probably be a template. I've got email templates that I set. That doesn't mean that you can't refine things. I mean, the whole point is just to save you time, giving you a structure, and so that you're spending the bulk of your time on the really impactful, nuanced work. Another thing that probably resonates with a lot of people is just avoiding errors. Manual processes, they introduce more chances for mistakes, and it isn't a representation of how good an attorney we are or how good, you know, how smart we are. Very often we're just in a rush, or there's, you know, there are 2 spaces in between a first and last name, and find and replace all didn't pick it up. We want to eliminate that too. If you happen to have a team, you know, I think it's really easy in terms of confidence of delegating things to your team, helping them grow a little bit, and making sure that you're focused on the most important tasks at hand for you, whether that's growing the business or concentrating on the really, you know, the more complex cases. But I think people really like the idea of having a tool that helps them delegate more confidently to their team. And then obviously, you know, at the end of the day, it's the most important thing we do is we just want to make our clients happy. So we're talking about convenience, satisfaction, transparency, and obviously just case turnaround, because time matters in all of these cases, and keeping bills down. I mean, this is a way to keep your bills down for that stuff that, you know, maybe we shouldn't be charging as much as, you know, we sometimes it was crazy how much I was charging, and you know, not all of it required my expertise. So we really want attorneys to focus on where you know, what they went to law school for, essentially. What are the whys here? You know, if you're having trouble kind of thinking about, well, what documents should be automated, I'm going to share some examples, but kind of, you know, unbundled services present this perfect opportunity to leverage automation, and you just think about repeatable processes. And the one thing I go back to is identify where you or your staff add unique value during the life cycle of the case, and automate everything else. So if it's something where it's just kind of data input and addresses and selecting from a couple options that, you know, if you can do something to expedite that process, that's something that should probably be automated. And just kind of a couple of examples, you know, of commonly automated documents in practice areas. Family law, you know, just like Dave said, huge area for him. It's probably our leading practice area, just because, you know, so much of it is procedural. There's a litigation component to it because you are in court, but you know, the petitions for divorce, the marital settlement agreements, the parenting plans, all the attendant documents. A lot of people come to us just wanting to do uncontested divorces. They know people that need this. They don't want to go through an extensive and really expensive process. And the documents, sometimes they can be complex, but they're pretty finite, and there are only so many different iterations, and we handle those really, really well. Another example is estate planning, and not just estate planning, but, you know, probates, guardianships, conservatorships. But again, another example of, you know, from an estate planning, purely perspective, a very transactional document where, I charge this much for a basic estate plan, I charge this much for an estate plan with a trust. Same thing with probate, petitions for probate and guardianships and conservatorships, very procedural, not tons of iterations, it's just lots and lots of documents. Civil litigation, it's kind of interesting that kind of difference between transactional and like pure litigation. On the litigation side of things, there are plenty of practice areas that can be automated in terms of landlord-tenant, heating up quite a bit. Employment law, personal injury. A lot of these documents are really low-hanging fruit for document automation, and the ROI becomes not so much, well, how much did I make off of the time invested, but can partially be kind of a peace of mind type of investment in terms of the fast pace of litigation, kind of feeling organized, knowing that you can get documents out really quickly if you need to. Immigration law is obviously very, very big right now, both just on a personal side in terms of petitions for citizenship, work permits, DACA renewals and petitions, that sort of thing, and from a business perspective for more business immigration focused attorneys. The one thing that people always they always do, well, I want to do discovery, or I want to do the most complex document that I have when they want to automate something. It's the correspondence that used to eat up my day. It's getting the engagement agreements out and the declination rate letters and status updates, and all of these things fit into not only keeping the client happy, but all grounds in many cases for in terms of your rules of contact, really staying communicative with your clients, where a lot of complaints from clients will come from. So you can kind of turn that on your head. It's especially important to have a framework in place as you start to get volume. If you start to use Unbundled Attorney, you're going to have lots of people coming through. To have some sort of workflow where it's easy to kind of map out your processes when people get update letters, what they're going to anticipate, and be able to use a lot of the same data inputs that you've collected along the way to produce different documents programmatically that will keep your clients apprised of what's going on in their case with minimum lift from you or minimum effort from you. And I'm going to do just a quick demonstration of what this might look like in practice, just so you can get a sense of this, but I'm going to try and be very, very brief. And so this is the Lawyaw platform. Oh, I think I'm sharing the wrong screen. Pardon me. Let's try this again. Okay, so this is the Lawyaw platform. It is web-based. I just have it saved as a bookmark in my browser, and what you can do in our platform, we have another platform for California court forms and the immigration forms, but basically you can put all of your Microsoft Word documents that you typically use into our system. And there's a very easy to use Microsoft Word add-in. We try to make this kind of like a no-code environment, so you're just really dropping fields in. And what we eventually want to get to is, not just assembling individual templates, but putting those templates into sets of documents that that you need to produce all together, either simultaneously or in very close succession. So I could have, my initial family law complaint set or an uncontested divorce or something like that. And I can say, okay, I want to generate this document set and tie it to a specific matter that I had previously input. And you don't have to have two-factor authentication enabled if you don't work at Lawyaw, but at Lawyaw you do. This is a great example of how we are cloud-based, so we will save all of the information. 775, 608. Pardon that. Okay. Let's get back in here. This is a view of the forms product right here. I'll go back into the templating tool. And we'll go back into that complaint set. And it always happens at the worst times. There's the generate document set. I'm going to tie this to an existing matter that I have collected some information from. I've already collected some information via a questionnaire that I had sent out, Carmela Soprano. And when I click next, any information that I had previously entered just automatically pops into the respective areas. And you can see how many times that information is repeated. And I just get a nice readout of all the different pieces of information that are required for completion of that template. We have a couple different types of fields. You can do short text, you can do long text, you can do multiple choice. So we try and make this really, really easy to use. Let's say I'll say no cases pending. So you can have different language that's saved in the system. But then I just click generate Word document, and it's going to give me a preview of what the documents look like. And the idea here is, to the extent that you can automate, we'd love to get you to 100%, but that's not the end goal. Our goal is to do that heavy lift for you so that you're not doing a save as and a find and replace all and a copy and paste. And you can just see all of your documents. They have consistent information in them. You spent a fraction of the time generating them, and you can spend the bulk of your time, making those little refinements that you may need to make. And more importantly, spending time kind of just communicating with your client. A lot of these people, that you're doing unbundled services for, they need help. You're providing a service, and this gives you more time for them to really be happy with the service that you've rendered. I can get rid of the highlight changes, but when I download, these just pop out as Microsoft Word documents that I can edit. I can also e-sign. Speaking about that questionnaire that I was talking about, if you have a bunch of templates in the system, we can create a questionnaire for you directly from those templates. I can just say, yeah, that was the template that I want to use. And I'll take all those different data inputs. I'll say this is the family law complaint questionnaire. You give it a description if I wanted to, but when I click create, it's just going to turn all those data inputs into questions that map to my specific documents. You could just collect information if you wanted to without mapping it to your documents, but then publish and send this link to a client, and they can log in and fill out their information, so you're doing even less of the work. So I know that there are a lot of different ways that you can kind of intake the client. It's a huge kind of choke point for a lot of firms, but that's why we try and develop tech that makes it easier for consumers to interact with you. So I promised that this would be short. I'm going to stick to that promise. We're going to go back to the webinar, but I'm hoping that was helpful. And Dave, I'll let you kind of take back over.
Okay, awesome. When I watch that as a user, I kind of go, it's cool to see the bells and whistles and so forth, but it's really hard to really fully grasp how important this is in terms of, having that intake questionnaires you guys just showed, which you took, maybe 45 seconds on, to have that integrated into your document automation. So you can create these questionnaires, send them to the client. You don't have to do all the intake yourself, right? You can send a questionnaire to the client. They put all the information in, it comes right into Lawyaw, and then if you already have your forms uploaded and tied to that matter, all the information is populates right into the documents, right? And so, gosh, I mean, the amount of time savings of just the data entry, the line by line, and also sitting there and intaking the client. Okay, can you spell that last name? Okay, and the date of birth? Yeah, okay, and the child, can you spell her first and last? Okay, let's get the middle name. It just takes so much time, right? And it's tedious, right? Whereas these things, when you can, the client can give you that information. They know their children's spelling and their date of birth and the various different information. So that saves you time that your team doesn't have to gather that information. The client can give it to you, and then it just streamlines right over to the paperwork. Every attorney we've worked with that's implemented document automation, it's a complete game changer. So, but let's talk about, how does this translate into money? How does this translate into you making more money in your practice? Because a lot of attorneys, I think, at first glance, like, oh yeah, it'll make me more efficient and make it more streamlined. But certainly anytime you're offering flat rate services like Andreas talked about, estate planning, probate, transactional, immigration, and it's a flat rate, how quickly you get that done is directly going to affect what's your ROI, or basically your effective hourly rate, right? So let's take an example service, right? Let's take a limited scope representation service, right? Draft documents, give the client advice, appear for a hearing, right? One hearing. $1,500. Let's say that's what you're going to charge to do that, right? In the past, it might take you 2 hours to intake and enroll that client, right? It takes you 30 minutes to talk to do the consultation, 30 minutes to an hour to basically sign that client up, get them, get that retainer agreement signed and collect the payment, okay? Then you got to do the intake, gather all the client's information. That is either you or a staff member, ideally, getting all that client data from the client, right? And then you have to start drafting all the paperwork. So then you got to take that client data from the intake forms that you've manually filled out or typed in. Then you have to translate that intake data onto the documents, manually entering in each of that information, right? So a couple hours intake enrollment, maybe 2-3 hours for document drafting, and then 2.5 hours for the court appearance. For a limited scope representation case, that could be about 7.5 hours, right? So you're making about $200 an hour for that limited scope service. It's okay. It's additional business and revenue for your firm. You would otherwise maybe turn that client away because maybe they didn't have the $5,000. And so by offering them a limited scope service, you're, giving that client, additional legal services and help, and also gathering $1,500 in revenue at $200 an hour. Still a good deal, but not necessarily something to get really exciting and write home about, which I think a lot of attorneys in the past might have thought like, yeah, Unbundled Services, it's, it's not a whole lot of income. I'm only getting 515, 2,000, whatever it might be. They'd rather steer towards the $10,000 clients, right? But once we start to implement legal technology here, and we can talk a lot about Unbundled Services and profitability, it starts to change the equation, right? So let's implement Lawyaw into this process, right? And so take note of the 2 hours for intake and enrollment and 3 hours for document drafting. Now let's implement Lawyaw. Okay, so now instead of it taking 2 hours to intake and enroll, now it takes 1 hour, right? Because now the intake is handled by the client, because the client can now complete that intake form, and also as you're doing the enrollment process, this information is being gathered into the intake questionnaires. Anything you're gathering from the client, you're capturing into your Lawyaw system so that it can be implemented in the documents. And then instead of it taking 3 hours to manually create all the documents, if it was a full set of 4 or 5 documents that Andreas has shown there with an example of a family law complaint, that can take a lot of time. Whereas, as they've statistically shown, and this is pretty true for all the attorneys we've said, usually cuts down about 2/3. I think he said 83%. Most of our attorneys say it's 2/3 of the time. It used to take them to draft documents. Now it now takes them, right? So about 1/3 of the time total reduces by 2/3. So instead of it being 3 hours, now it's an hour, right? So to deliver that same limited scope service at $1,500, and you can think of this as this trust or the will or whatever, you can translate to the practice area that you serve if you don't do family law or you're not doing limited scope at this time. How long is it going to take me? Well, instead of 7.5 hours, now it takes you 4.5 hours. What does that mean in terms of your effective hourly rate? What you're getting paid effective hour per hour putting into that case. Now we're at $333 an hour, right? So we went from $200 an hour to $333. Well, that's pretty good, right? Well, what if you also implemented a paralegal, right? And had a paralegal doing the remaining drafting, right? And we do the same equation. All right, so let's say you pay the paralegal $50 an hour to do an hour's worth of work, right? So let's say it's 2 hours. So let's just be really, conservative and say you paid $100 for those documents. Usually paralegals are $30 to $50 an hour, and if it only takes an hour with document automation, we're being kind of conservative here, but let's say it's $100. Now you're keeping $1,400 that limited scope rep because you paid $100 for the paralegal. So now you have 0 hours of document drafting, hour intake, 2.5 hours court appearance. Now you're making $400 an hour because it only takes you 3.5 hours to deliver that limited scope service. Intake the client, sign them up, get the documents drafted out the door, and then show up for that hearing, that 2.5 hour hearing, right? So that's what our attorney's doing every single day. Now, one of the things that's changed in the last year and a half is these court appearances used to be in person, where you have to drive down to the court, show up, park, go up in the court. Sometimes they'll be heard right away. Sometimes you have to sit there for 2-3 hours. So on average, these court hearings were taking 2 to 3 hours to get done. Well, now a lot of these court hearings are doing on Zoom. Hopefully they'll continue to do that for a while, but at least for the time being, when a lot of these hearings are being done on Zoom, now you show up for that hearing, the hearing happens promptly at that time, and then it's over and you're done, right? So instead of it being 2.5 hours for a court appearance, now it's maybe an hour and 25 minutes or an hour and a half hour and 15 minutes, right? Because after the hearing, you kind of debrief with the client, and then you're off, right? So now, to get to a limited scope service out the door, maybe 2.5 hours, 2 hours short. And so what is the effect on the hourly rate? $6.25 in this equation. But as you can start to see that, like, the amount of time it takes to do that intake, to get those documents done, and certainly to do the appearance and so forth, has a big impact, big difference, makes a big difference in terms of what you're keeping financially to deliver these limited scope and unbundled services. And of course, that's what you're making, right? So, and this is what most of our attorneys would make when they're delivering unbundled service, usually somewhere between $570 to $750 an hour once they've implemented the document automation process and have the intake, streamlined in that way. Okay. So if you want to get a little bit more background on kind of how these two platforms work, even beyond this webinar, we also did a podcast interview with Tucker, who's the CEO and founder of Lawyaw, and he kind of gave the whole background story, gives a little bit more context to how Lawyaw was started, and then also we kind of talk a lot about how unbundled attorneys have utilized document automation, give a bunch of different examples of the ways that they've done it, the types of cases, and of course how that's impacted their firms as a result. So this is a good webinar to check out at that link there, so you can watch the full podcast. It's actually not a webinar; it's a podcast interview where we had Tucker come on the show and talk a little bit more about the saga that became Lawyaw.
The saga, indeed. Love when we get done with webinars to get through our presentations quick, because it allows us to do more Q&A, and we give people time back in their day. I want to put our information up there. People want to get hold of us. I'm going to put my actual email address in the chat as well if you want to reach out to me directly. So a couple questions come through that I tried to address. I'll check if there are a couple more, but I'm happy to kind of just open things up, have a conversation there. I got a couple things that I've been noticing. Douglas had a couple of questions mentioning Clio. He saw that Clio was referenced in the platform, and yes, we do have a direct integration with Clio for those of you who use it. So you can pull over all of your contacts and matters and associated custom fields. So that's another great way to kind of reuse some of the data that you're already keeping in your system, not just in terms of speeding things up, but it's all about ensuring kind of consistency. That's what we're really after as well, because that's when mistakes happen and filings come back because there was a mistake, something wasn't followed correctly. We're just trying to systematize the stuff that is predictable, so that you can focus your time on really helping your clients out with their nuanced work.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So we don't have any. Do we have any other questions besides that?
Oh, I had one question for you, Dave. So one of the things that I've noticed, kind of talking about, kind of creating this alternate revenue stream, or really focusing on this sort of thing, a lot of kind of groups going around and buying up law firms, I've noticed. And one of the things that I've had a couple of attorneys come to me to say is, they want some sort of turnkey solution to automate a lot of this stuff, and they want to kind of generate more growth because, valuing a law firm, there are a couple of different methods to do it, but very often it just kind of comes down to assets, liabilities, and kind of a book of business that you can kind of look to over the last couple of years. And a lot of people, I'm seeing this trend towards people who are, really kind of looking to do this so that if they ever look to sell the practice potentially, if you have something turnkey, you're not just selling, your book of business, whatever, but you're selling all of the IP associated with it, the process that you put in place, a revenue that seems to be really, really predictable. People are like not using their names anymore. I see a lot of people changing their names. So it'll be like San Francisco estate planning attorneys instead of Andreas Becker, attorney at law. Have you been noticing any of that in the kind of unbundled space? I've been noticing that a lot more, but I wasn't sure if that was happening in the unbundled space.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of firms that will take a kind of a more branded approach because they're, building systems, building procedures, and a whole process around how they practice law. And so that kind of gets wrapped into these acquisitions, I would imagine. Certainly if it's law offices of so-and-so, it's a little bit more challenging to decouple that from the firm. So that makes a whole lot of sense to be more of a kind of a brand built firm. And I would say that a lot of attorneys nowadays, if they're offering unbundled services, are very well positioned to be able to thrive in any market economy or any kind of situation. And then of course, like you're saying, if they build kind of a business system or business procedure that can be documented, shared, and then handed off to somebody else where they could just pick that up and run with it, that's certainly going to help a lot in terms of their ability to increase the valuation of their business. But, more to the point, I think no matter what as well, is that no matter what happens to the economy, whether we have a major downturn, depending, no one really knows what happens when we come out of this, pandemic, whenever that may happen, and or when moratoriums lift and so forth, what's going to happen to the economy? There's always going to be a need for attorneys providing, services at these price points. And so it kind of sets up the firms to be able to sustain and weather pretty much any storm in the economy that they're going to see. And so in the event they wanted to, exit the business or something like that in whatever different environment that they're seeing, it should be, very easy to show the profitability of the firm and the success of the firm because, attorneys have been able to operate through 2008, through different kinds of crashes and so forth, because they're delivering a service that, meets the legal needs as well as the financial budgets of the average working family in the United States and beyond.
100%. That's a really good point. And like these systems are replicable across different practice areas. A lot of people during the pandemic, it was kind of hard being a PI attorney. People aren't driving, people aren't out at the supermarkets looking and calling certain things like that. All of a sudden we started to see tons of people kind of transitioning to family law because family law was one of those areas that was completely insulated and for, better, but more likely worse. People just living together and there are a lot more divorces. So it kind of understanding these systems and using some of these tools can also be really beneficial in terms of understanding the different areas that may be very, adjacent to different a practice area that you may be doing, but that you may look into as some other area that you want to get into, hopefully not caused by, need because of a pandemic, but just being opportunistic potentially.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So, especially for any lawyers that are doing this practice area, family law, estates, immigration, bankruptcy, all those different practice areas, they're going to be, some of those are more conducive to unbundling than others. Not so much for bankruptcy. You generally have to appear for the 341A, but all of these are very conducive for document automation for sure. If you are an attorney that practices in those areas and wants to grow the practice and get more clients and more cases, in those practice areas, what lawyers will usually do is they'll provide full representation on a payment plan. That's how they'll typically work with us. They'll draft documents and do the full case, but they'll do it they'll allow the person to make a deposit and then make payments from there. And so we can certainly generate leads for those areas of practice. But if you're going to move forward in that direction, it's going to help you a lot to have some kind of a document automation system in place to be able to streamline those deliveries of those services so that it takes you less time to get those things out the door. Bankruptcy is the game of high volume, and just having a good system for capturing all that client data, the debts, the debtors, the creditors, all that kind of stuff, and getting that intake from the client, getting all those documents prepared. So the applications for document automation, certainly anytime you have a flat rate service, if you're delivering unbundled services, I really see them as being absolutely essential because these are the types of things that take so much time in these practice areas. And by getting them to be a lot more streamlined with these workflows, they're just going to become a lot more profitable. And that enables you to either build a greater margin for yourself, or if you need to, offer more competitive pricing, right? Because you can get services done in half the time of any other lawyer. That's an advantage, right? You're either going to make more money, or you can say, instead of offering a $2,000 BK, you get her $1,500 because it only takes you 2 hours to get the service out the door, right? Versus, 5 hours for somebody else that can't compete with that, right? So these are some of the things that you can do to make yourself a lot more competitive in the market, and then affect your pricing or however else you want to position your firm relative to everybody else.
Yeah, a lot of people want to capture more of the market, and your service, especially during the pandemic, seeing so many people come through who are using you and saying, I was not expecting this. I'm burying leads. Things have changed quite a bit from the meet and greets and that sort of thing. I don't like to fearmonger by any means whatsoever, but it's important for people to investigate all the different channels that they could be leveraging to generate quality leads, because consumers are finding us in different ways. And Dave and Unbundled have certainly done, just an excellent job kind of leading the way in terms of creating a service that makes it really easy for attorneys to keep that pipeline.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, I'm glad that everyone was able to jump in and learn more about this. There's a lot of misconceptions around unbundled services for sure. And so, the advent of technology has certainly made it a lot more efficient and profitable. But I will say that a lot of our attorneys will lead with unbundled services. Every single attorney across the network also provides full representation. We don't have any lawyers that just solely do unbundled service. They also do full representation as well. And with the document automation too, like that's also going to speed up the same processes, whether you're doing full representation or unbundled services. But what we do find as well is that when you start the client with an unbundled service, it's kind of a low flat fee, something they can afford to get started with. And then once you deliver that service, that about 2/3 of the clients are going to transition and want additional services from there, whether it be full representation or additional limited scope. So even if you're all doing full representation right now, the document automation systems are going to make that a lot more efficient, and we can also provide leads for that type of practice as well. But we will certainly encourage you to implement limited scope services, because there's going to be a lot more folks that can move forward with that service to get started with, rather than just starting with the initial retainer. So for those of you that are just learning about limited scope or curious about learning more about how to implement it, you can check out the podcast on our website, unbundledattorney.com/podcast, or just click the podcast button. We've got over 60 lawyers that have been with us for many, many years, talking about how they use these systems, how they deliver unbundled services, how they do full representation. It's a good resource for you guys to check out and just kind of get acclimated to how these services and how different attorneys we work with all across the country are implementing these service options. But I'll say, one of the things that they talk about in almost every episode, which is why we started, hanging out with Lawyaw and Tucker and Andreas, is like, oh yeah, it just takes us a long time to get these documents done. We're trying to figure out ways to be more efficient. We're like, man, you got to use this Lawyaw team to, start learning more about the platform. And obviously the marriage of these two services has been really great to help the lawyers, get these services done a lot quicker.
Totally. And people had asked, everyone's going to be receiving a recording of this meeting. It'll take probably sometimes like 2-3 hours to render in our system. I don't know why it takes that long, but everyone's going to be getting an email from Livestorm, so you'll be able to reference things. And we'll send a follow-up email to recipients just with some resources and the deck if you'd like it. But, again, I put my email in the chat if you want to reach out to me directly. Dave, you mentioned some other stuff, and I could keep on talking about this forever. I love the idea of kind of using flat fees as kind of almost a fly trap for lead generation itself. People will come in, you do a good job with one thing, that leads to a referral, or they come back to you for something more significant. So obviously a lot of synergies here, but I hope this was helpful to everyone. And we'll stay on for a little bit longer, but if anyone has any questions or wants to reach out. But thank you, Dave. This was a long time coming. I'm happy that we were able to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael was asking just in terms of pricing are you talking about for leads, Michael, or for Lawyaw? We're seeing you're typing. I mean, I guess I can certainly give my pricing. For lead generation, our leads typically range somewhere between, if you're just a landlord tenant, so from $75 up to $150, depending on the practice area. Bankruptcy and criminal as being the more cost heavy, more expensive leads, just because of the cost of advertising. And then it's billed per lead for each lead that we deliver to the attorney's office. And then, really where it comes from a financial standpoint is what the conversion rate is going to be. And that's really what we focused on as a company, is generating the highest quality, highest converting leads in the legal industry, and offer a guarantee to that effect as well. So that when you're generating these leads and you're talking to clients, you're having more clients out of 5, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 10 at the worst, retaining your services consistently, so you don't have to go through 10, 15, 20 leads to find a client. So that's what we really focused on, is generating the highest quality leads we can, so that you're converting the leads effectively. And then Andreas, do you want to give a little info on average price for Lawyaw? Yeah, so
if you're a California attorney, or you're just looking for the federal USCIS immigration forms, we have like a different platform, very similar. But that's like $59 a month for a single user. Includes all the forms, the local forms as well, and then a court compliant e-sign tool. And then as you add more users, there's like team pricing, so it's not like $59 per user, but it's per month. And then the templating tool, which I was kind of showing to you, and I agree, it was a quick overview, but I try not to get salesy, and I can supply additional videos to anyone upon request. That's typically $99 for a single user. And then as you get into more users, the price drops down per user. We also have a templating team. If you don't want to set the templates up, pretty straightforward how to set them up. But some people just say, hey, I love what I saw. How much to set up my templates? And we have a templating team that will provide you a quote if you don't even want to touch it. But yeah, talk to us about pricing.
Yeah.
Email hello@Lawyaw or Andreas@Lawyaw.com. It looks like we can give people back 4 minutes of their time.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Appreciate the interest in these ways of practicing, and certainly need all the attention we can get to impact access to justice in this country. So thanks, everyone, for being involved and for all the questions.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Andreas.
Absolutely. You too.